welcome back. Today we're going to be introducing absolute value functions. Okay, so absolute value is talking about distance. So if I talk about distance from, let's say, your house, that's your house, okay, and you're going to walk from your house to school. Okay, let's just say that from your house to your school, the distance is about 1 mile. Okay? So if you start at your house and walk to school, it's 1 mile. It is the same distance if you start at school and you walk back home, right? It's still 1 mile, as long as you go the same route. So it doesn't matter if you start at point A and walk to point B, or if you start at point B and walk to point A. It's still the same distance. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about absolute value. So let's look at a number line. So if you start at 0, if I go to -3, that's to the left, 1, 2, 3. Okay, if I go left 3 units, it's still a positive number, right? Yes, I go to -3, but it's still 3 units. Even if I go right 3, 1, 2, 3, it's still a positive 3 units. Same thing if I go 5 right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units. Or if I go to -5, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's still 5 units. So absolute value is always going to be what? Always, excuse me, positive. Okay? Absolute value is always positive. So if I took the absolute value brackets, that's what these are. Let me highlight them. So these brackets right here are called absolute value brackets. So anything in that absolute value bracket has to output a positive number. If you put 0 in the absolute value brackets, it's just going to output a 0 because 0 is nor positive or negative. And if you put a +5, it still outputs a +5 unit. Okay, cool. So if I took the absolute value of 7, absolute value of 7 would just be simply 7. The absolute value of -4 would be a +4, right? The absolute value of -1/2 would be +1/2. And the absolute value of 6 would just be +6. So anything that outputs from an absolute value bracket is going to be positive. Okay, so let's try to see what this would look like on a graph. So everything that we've dealt with up until this point have looked like a line on a graph because we dealt with the linear functions. Now let's see what an absolute value function is going to look like. So let's do our input-output chart with our x there, our rule in the middle, and then we're going to graph x comma y. Let's do -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3. Okay, if I plug in a -3 into that absolute value bracket, it's going to output a +3. I'm going to go ahead and plot -3, 3, which is -3, up 3, right there. Input a 2 into my absolute value bracket, it's going to output a +2. Going to graph -2, 2, -2, 2. Input a 1 into my absolute value bracket, it's going to be a +1. I'm going to go ahead and plot -1, 1. Right there. And put a 0 into my absolute value brackets. It's going to output a 0. I'm going to plot 0, 0, which is my origin right there. Okay? So right now it looks like a line. Right? Awesome. So this is where it starts to change. So if I input a 1, okay, I'm going to output a +1. I'm going to end up graphing 1, 1, which is right there. Input a 2. I output a 2. 2, 2. Which is right there, and then I input a 3, I output a 3, which is 3, 3, and that's my ordered pair. So you can kind of see that this graph has a V shape. Whoa. It has a V shape, like such. And all of my absolute value brackets are going to be some shape of a V, whether it's a wide V, an upside down V, narrow, And that's kind of what we're going to get into the next section. Okay, so let's go ahead and solve these equations. So when I solve an absolute value equation, it's very similar to solving an equation, but there's one difference. So if I plug in a value for x, okay, if I plug in a value for x, how am I going to output a positive 4? Well, now if I plug in a 4 into x, the absolute value of 4 is 4. Or what else can you put in? I could also put in a negative 4, right? So if I put in the absolute value of negative 4, it's going to output a positive 4. Okay, same thing here. If I want to output a 10, okay, I could plug in a positive 10, or I could plug in a negative 10. Ooh, that's not a negative 10. Negative 10. Awesome. Okay, not a money problem, but just trying your own number 3. Okay, awesome. So now we have a little bit different type of problem. It's just going to require 1 or 2 more steps. So the difference between 1 and 4 is that I have another value in 4 inside the absolute value bracket. So the first thing when you go ahead and solve an absolute value equation is make sure your brackets are isolated. Are your brackets isolated? Okay, that means are your brackets the only thing on one side? And you would say yes. Okay, cool. So now, if I plug in a value, okay, I want these whole brackets to output an 8. So these brackets have to equal positive 8, or they have to equal negative 8. All right? So I need to see what value is going to make x plus 1 equal to positive 8 and x plus 1 equal to negative 8. So first thing you're going to do is you're going to break off into 2 different equations. So one that equals a negative 8 and one that equals a positive 8. So here, you're going to drop the absolute value bracket. So it's just going to say x plus 1. You're going to write directly what's inside the absolute value equals what type of 8? A negative 8. Or drop the absolute value bracket, x plus 1 equals a positive 8. Okay? Now you just have 2 one-step equations, and you're going to go ahead and solve. So in my left equation, you're going to go ahead and minus 1 from both sides, and x equals negative 8 minus 1 is negative 9. Or here, you're going to subtract 1, same thing. X equals 8 minus 1, which is 7. And those are your answers. So when you're talking about absolute value brackets, for the most part, you're going to have 2 solutions. For the most part. And we'll go into special cases. Okay, if you wanted to go ahead and check, negative 9 plus 1 is negative 8. The absolute value of negative 8 is 8. So that holds true. If I plug in the 7, 7 plus 1 is 8. The absolute value of 8 is 8, which is also true. Let's try another one. The first thing I want to do is make sure my brackets are isolated, which they are. So then I'm going to go ahead and break off my 2 equations. One that equals a negative 4, one that equals a positive 4. So I'm going to go ahead and write my equation without the absolute value brackets. X minus 5 equals negative 4. Or x minus 5 equals a positive 4. Okay? Okay, good. And when I go ahead and solve my left equation, I'm going to have to add 5 to both sides. Add 5 to both sides. I'm going to be left with x equals negative 4 plus 5 is 1. Or add 5 to both sides. Add 5 to both sides. I'm going to end up with x equals 9. Those are my 2 equations. Go ahead and try number 6. It's just a money problem. Okay, so now let's go ahead and have some challenge problems. These are very similar to the last 2 we did, or actually 4 we did, but there's going to be one more step. So the difference between 7 and 4 is that I have another number on the side of the absolute value brackets. Now remember, you want to isolate the absolute value brackets. Let me write that. Isolate absolute value brackets. Okay? So I want to isolate those brackets. So I'm going to get rid of that 4. So let me go a side note. If I replaced that entire absolute value brackets with x, that would read 4 times, right, because that's multiplication, 4 times x equals 16. How would I get x by itself? I'll go ahead and do the inverse operation, which is divide by 4. So that's the same thing I want to do. I want to get rid of that 4, so I have to divide both sides by 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1, and I'm left with the absolute value of x minus 1 equals 16 divided by 4 is 4. Okay, awesome. So now when I go ahead and solve, my brackets are isolated, and this is just like the two-step one we did before. So break it off into a negative 4 and a positive 4. X minus 1 equals negative 4, or x minus 1 equals a positive 4. Add 1 to both sides. X equals negative 4 plus 1 is negative 3. Or, okay, here I have x minus 1 equals 4. Same thing, add 1 to both sides. X equals 4 plus 1, which is 5. And that's my answer. Okay, now 8 is slightly different. Okay, now 8 says 2 times the absolute value of x plus 5 equals 7. Now I'm going to do a side note over here. Make believe this said 2x plus 5 equals 7. Okay? Now the first thing I would do is move that 5, correct? Then I would divide both sides by 2. You're essentially doing the same thing. I'm going to isolate these absolute value brackets. So I'm going to go ahead, before I split up into my 2 equations, I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides, and I'm going to have 2 times the absolute value of x equals 7 minus 5, which is 2. Now I have 2 times the absolute value of x equals 2. I want to get rid of that 2 by doing the inverse operation. It's multiplying the absolute value of x. So I want to go ahead and divide. So when I divide, I have the absolute value of x equals 2 divided by 2 is 1. Am I done? No. If you look back at your first number 1 equation, it's just like the simple one step. Okay, so I want to say, okay, what value of x can I plug in to output a 1? Well, x could equal positive 1, or x could equal negative 1. Okay, good job. That wraps up this video. See you next time.